We're now starting our next topic, which is on cells and cells theory. Okay, so first I'm going to have you watch this, and then you are going to copy down the notes from the slides.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck two together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
Okay, so that had a lot of the information that we're going to go over right now and that you need to take the notes down on. So cell theory kind of started with the idea that there was something smaller than what the naked eye could see. And that was really started, okay, so we'll do these real quick. So the 5 scientists that contribute directly or indirectly to the cell theory are Robert Hooke, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow. Okay, so Robert Hooke was really the first one that took and redesigned the current compound microscope of the time, and he sliced really, really thin pieces of cork. And when he looked at that through the microscope, what he saw were these rectangular, empty objects that looked like little cells, is what he called them, based on the fact that they were rectangular and they looked empty inside. And the truth is, they're not empty inside, but that was the limitation at the time. Then that was followed up by Anton Leeuwenhoek, and he went through and he kind of created his own microscope. And his big significant part of the cell theory is that he was the first to see something living, and that was because he looked at the material that was on his teeth and he could see the bacteria. Again, he couldn't really see anything that was inside of the bacteria, but since the bacteria have a very thick outer membrane, he was able to see that shape. Then there was Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. Matthias was able to look at different cells of plants, and from there he concluded that all plants were made of cells. And Theodor Schwann, he actually looked at samples or specimens of different animal cells, and he concluded that all animals were made of cells. And so we kind of build up on what the prior people were able to see and make these other theories about what things are made up of. And then Virchow, it says in there that he wasn't really the first to come up with this idea, but a lot of that times that would happen where you have a scientist who is not as well known as another scientist, or a scientist that can make his case better. So there was a bit of stealing back in the day. This even happened when Francis and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, something that we'll talk about much later. Anyway, Rudolf Virchow, he was able to confirm the fact that cells did arise from pre-existing cells. So you have either what was called binary fission, or you have mitosis or meiosis. And these will be things that mitosis and meiosis are topics that we'll be talking about quite a bit in the future. And then there was binary fission, just means the cell literally split in half. Okay, the cell theory is made up of 3 different parts. You do need to know these. 1, that all living things are made of cells. 2, cells are the basic unit of life. And 3, that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay, so the cell theory, all living things can be made up of cells. That doesn't matter if it's from a unicellular, one-celled organism or a multicellular organism that is like us, composed of many different cells that organize into tissues and then organs and organ systems before becoming the organism. The cell theory also includes that cells are the most basic unit of life. That means even at the smallest of all processes can be carried out by one single cell. Now, sometimes the cell can be a standalone organism, so unicellular, or sometimes the organism cannot be a standalone, like people are not a standalone cell. We're multicellular, but even at our most basic, the single cell is able to perform all of life's processes. Even knowing all these cells that we're discussing are very diverse. The 2 types that we're going to be really looking more into are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. The 3rd part of the cell theory says that all cells come from pre-existing cells, whether they replicate binary, okay, that's this as an example, or if they go through mitosis, which an animal cell and a plant cell does, or meiosis, which is specific sex cells within organisms that we'll be learning more about.